Good evening, everybody. I'm calling to order this meeting of the Planning and Development Council of the Town of Oakville. And Council, I need to ask you if there are any declarations of pecuniary interest. And Madam Clerk, I'm not seeing a forest of hands, or any, in fact. Council, we need a mover and seconder to resolve into committee of the whole, as is typical. Councilor Lischina and Councilor Knoll, typical for planning and development meetings. All those in favor? Opposed, if any, and that is carried. We are now in the relaxed rule structure of our committee of the whole method of meeting. We have no consent items listed for this agenda, and there are no confidential consent items in addition. So we have our first public hearing item, and that is the public meeting and recommendation report on the temporary use bylaw extension for the Vic Hadfield Golf Center. And we have a report from our Planning Services Department and a presentation from Tricia Collingwood, who is our senior planner. Ms. Collingwood, Council looks forward to your presentation. Councilor O'Meara.
Sorry, at the behest of my council colleagues, I personally don't need to see a report. I'm not sure if anybody does, but I would be happy to move the report if they're so inclined.
Or maybe the council colleagues.
Is Vic here? Thank you, Councillor. We have had a public meeting on this, and the recommendation has been published. Do the ward councillors have an opinion about this?
Sorry, I was trying to make my microphone work. I am fine as long as Councilor Palmer is. I'm fine without the report. I thank staff for their time and efforts on this.
We need, Madam Clerk.
I was just saying we should pull the topic.
I'll get to that. I'll go now. Are there members of the public with information for council on this file? Well, council, it's time for a decision then. We need a motion to approve, I guess. Councilor Palmer? Sorry? I think that's just a touch out of order. Councilor Palmer has moved approval. May I put the vote? All in favor? That is carried. Thank you, Mr. Fay. That was a good presentation. The next discussion item is the recommendation report, draft plan of condominium for BEC Trafalgar at 3075 Trafalgar Road. And once again, we have our senior planner standing by with her presentation. Ms. Collingwood.
Thank you, Mayor Burton. The purpose of this report is to present the recommendation on the draft plan of condominium application submitted by BEC Trafalgar GP Inc. for Block 15 within 3075 Trafalgar Road. The intent of the draft plans of condominium is to create a common elements condominium for 71 townhome units. The condominium plan would provide vehicular, pedestrian access as well as visitor parking. The property is located at the northeast corner of Dundas and Trafalgar Road. The lands subject to this application are approximately 1.57 hectares and are shown under the red square as the Phase 2 site plan. The surrounding land uses include natural heritage system, on-street residential freehold townhomes, future high-density development lands along Trafalgar and Dundas. There are multiple names for this site, and I just kind of wanted to list them quickly because I know there's this is probably the first time this property has been in front of council this year. It was originally known as the Belmont property, and it was the Minto lands, then the Dundas Trafalgar Inc., DTI, Minto Brandhaven Blocks, which is also BEC Trafalgar, and MSHE. The development of the subdivision consists of 3 partners, Minto, Brandhaven, and Emshie, which is why there's so many names that are tossed around for this site. This slide shows the draft plan of subdivision that was approved at the Ontario Municipal Board in September of 2014. Along with the plan of subdivision, zoning bylaw 2014-094 was also approved to permit the proposed development for all of the lands in this subdivision except for the ones that abut Trafalgar Road, which are shown here. The blocks that are shaded are known as the Trafalgar Road blocks, and they're subject to bylaw 2019-045. The entire subdivision is proposed to accommodate approximately 2,200 units from medium-density townhomes, retirement residential along Dundas, and high-density condo buildings along Trafalgar. The large blocks shown here were the first of the site plan applications to come in, and they were approved in 2017 for 405 townhomes. The subject lands for tonight are shown as here as Block 15 of the subdivision plan in blue. The blocks shown in green are freehold townhouse blocks that did not require site plan approval. And we also have 2 active site plan applications in which are indicated with the pink stars. Along Dundas is the Emshie development for the retirement residences, and the northern star is for the Brandhaven site plan for 2 residential condo towers. There's no good way to show this draft plan of condominium, just sheer length. So it's on its side right now. The applicant proposes a common element condominium consisting of shared vehicular and pedestrian access for the 71 townhomes, as well as 9 visitor spaces. Those are noted here with the red stars. And 2 common element pedestrian walkways and public easements. Those are shown with the red arrows. The red arrow here is coming off of William Colson Drive. The other red arrow links to the Natural Heritage Trail System. The purpose of the proposed plan of condominium is to legally create the common element portion, which is the roadway, the visitor parking, and the public easements, walkways, to create that common element portion of the development to be managed by the condominium corporation. In summary, the proposed draft plans of condominium will legally create the common element, as I was just speaking about, for the vehicular and pedestrian access, as well as the visitor parking spaces. A full circulation of the condominium application was undertaken, and there are no outstanding financial, legal, or planning issues to be resolved. Public participation for this development occurred through the plan of subdivision, zoning bylaw amendment, and site plan processes. And staff put forward the following recommendation for council's consideration as shown here. I would like to make one note before I read it that I did accept a revised condo plan that fixed a lot line that was millimeters off, but that the Director of Planning Services be authorized to grant draft plan approval of the draft plan of condominium submitted by BEC Trafalgar GP Inc., revised and dated May 15th, 2019, subject to the conditions contained in Appendix A of the Planning Services report dated May 17th, 2019, and that notice of council's decision reflect that the comments from the public have been appropriately addressed as described in the staff report. That concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Ms. Collingwood, thank you very much for your usual thorough job. Councillor, do you have questions? Councillor Elgar.
Thanks very much for the presentation. A couple of questions. First one is, when are we having a report coming back regarding parking spaces for units? Do we have a schedule when that's coming?
There. We are bringing back a report on parking on the terms of reference for the July meeting as council had requested in a motion to us. So that will set the terms of reference, and in that terms of reference, it will set out the further reports that we'll bring forward, as well as the timing.
So in staff's opinion, based on we have 71 units, and we're going to give them a grand total of 71 spaces, because the visitor is 9, but that's not for the people. So what we're really saying is, no one in there is going to need more than one car, which is causing a major issue for a lot of us in new sections of Oakville. So does staff really think it's a good idea to have only one space per unit?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, there's actually 2 spaces per unit. There's 144 spaces on site, as well as the 9 visitor parking spaces.
So, oh, there's 144.
Yes,
Okay. So everybody's got 2 spaces?
yes. They have a garage plus their driveway.
Oh, the garage is on grade, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the basement. That's the problem, I know, okay. Because you're counting, and see, that is exactly what's been happening. Because it's a slab on grade, the garage, which is one parking spot, is the storage area for it replaces what used to be called a basement in a lot of houses, so. Okay, well, I look forward to the report coming back also on what we can do to solve this problem going forward, because it's going to be a big issue up there. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Palmer?
Thank you for your presentation. So I understand that the OMB approved the draft plan of subdivision and zoning bylaw in 2014, and the site is being developed in accordance with the approvals. Therefore, the development and approvals predate the visitor parking concerns that have been identified by council for North Oakville. And I just want to echo Councillor Elgar's comments, because I live in this subdivision, and he's absolutely right. I mean, the garages do end up getting used as storage spaces, but we can count them as parking spots. But in this case, there's no on-street parking available. So it puts the residents in a worse situation, because now there's 9 spots that 71 houses are fighting for. And in previous developments in that area, the developers have gone ahead and, the builders, they've made visitor parking, which now residents fight to park their everyday cars there. So really, there's no parking left for visitors. So I do really look forward to receiving that report, because I think it's an ongoing issue, especially in North Oakville and the new areas of Oakville. And we really need to address parking, because we're running into a situation where we're not going to be able to reverse any of this, and it's going to create a huge problem in our communities. So I am looking forward to receiving that report. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Robertson?
I was just wondering, in terms of William Colston Avenue, will it have parking on both sides of that and bike path?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, there are no plans at this time to include parking along William Colson. As for the bike path, I believe, I can't say for sure, I believe that in that neighborhood, we are relying more on on-street bike routes, the natural heritage trail system, and then the multi-use trail system that will be along Trafalgar Road.
Thank you.
Councillor Sanju?
Thank you, Your Worship. I want to thank staff for the report. Just a general question, given the fact that the plan of subdivision was approved in 2014, do we have an indication from the region regarding the widening of Trafalgar Road in this area? How far is that setback going to be, given how close they seem to look in the map?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, the Trafalgar Road EA was approved a number of years ago. 2015 stands out in my head. I do know that they're working on the section south of Dundas right now. It does not include the Dundas-Trafalgar intersection, the 2 sections. They are working on that. It's a 2-year construction timeline. So I'm not sure where they are, weather dependent, but they are not expecting to finish till 2021. At that point, they'll move up to the north end. And then again, a 2-year construction window. They are 60% done, the detailed design for that section. However, capital budgets change as they go every year, and so the expectation right now is 2021, 2022 to get started.
And then, do we have an indication then how that changes our setback guidelines? Right now, we're seeing that it meets our bylaws, but will that change given the widening later?
The bylaw was constructed with the region as they were participants in the hearing.
Thank you for that. And then one last question. So if we are using this area, so per Councillor Elgar's and Councillor Parmar's and Councillor Robertson's comments, if we are relying on this being a heavily transit-oriented area, and given the fact that Trafalgar is going to be a heavy kind of use node for that transit, my understanding is that we're still waiting on more information from the region and the province on bus rapid transit. If we go ahead and approve something like this, I have concerns about whether these people are actually going to either, one, be able to park, and two, be able to get back and forth from where they need to go on Trafalgar. It's already a very busy road. And I have concerns about the infrastructure there generally. I know that's something that we can't fix right now, but I wanted to voice that concern.
Thank you, Councillor. Anyone else? All righty. Are there members of the audience are there members of the public here with information for council on this matter? Madam Clerk, I see none. Council, it's time to make a decision. Councillor Sanju.
I move.
Councillor Sanju moves the recommendation as presented by Ms. Collingwood. May I put the vote? All those in favor? Opposed, if any, and that's carried. Council, we now have the Maintenance of Vacant Properties Bylaw Report from Municipal Enforcement Services. We have a presentation from John Maddox, and we have registered delegations from Trista Lockwood and Elizabeth Chalmers. Mr. Maddox, we're all ears.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor. Let me open the presentation here. Okay. Good evening, Mr. Mayor and members of council. I'm here tonight to present item number 3 on tonight's agenda, which is the Vacant Property Registry Bylaw. You may recall at the council meeting on November 3rd, 2014, staff were directed to report back to council on what options are available to ensure vacant properties are kept in good repair and possible actions that the town could take to encourage timely development, including but not limited to registration of vacant buildings, vacant building fees that escalate over the length of time that the property remains vacant, and regular quarterly inspections of vacant buildings by bylaw staff with a fee charged to the owner of the property on a cost recovery basis to ensure property standards are being met and action taken. Over the last few months, staff have spent many hours developing a bylaw that achieves these goals. Staff held a public meeting on April 3rd, 2019 at Town Hall, where residents were invited to provide input on issues they were encountering in their communities related to vacant properties and to provide input on the proposed bylaw. 17 residents attended the open house and shared their comments with staff. We also received emails from 16 residents who were unable to make the meeting but still wished to provide comments. Common areas of concern raised by residents where properties become unsightly, they have a negative effect on property values, they can become infested with pests, they attract trespassers, they become a target for criminal activity, they deteriorate overall community standards, and can become a health and safety concern. These issues can also put strain on municipal enforcement, police, and fire resources. Although the town's property standards bylaw addresses buildings left vacant for 90 days, it only requires property owners to shut off all non-essential services and ensure that the buildings are kept secure. Typically, this is achieved through locking the doors and boarding up windows in order to make it difficult for people to enter the property. There is no requirement for registering these properties or buildings, and staff are most often unaware that there may be property standards issues until a complaint is received. Locating these owners in some instances can be difficult, often delaying remedial work or enforcement action. Remedial action can also be delayed if orders are appealed. A vacant property registry bylaw, if passed, would supplement the town's current property standards and lot maintenance bylaws by adding requirements that would ensure vacant properties are continually maintained, and registration requirements would include the following. Register vacant property and building with the town after 90 days of vacancy. Ensure their current contact information was correct. Provide secondary emergency contact information. provide proof of insurance on the property, permit inspection of the property or building, required to comply with property standards and lot maintenance bylaws. So as part of the bylaw development, a full review of the fees was conducted with the assistance of the Finance Department. The review was based on full cost recovery methodology related to administration and enforcement duties. As a result of that review, the fees on the screen are proposed for tonight's bylaw. The registry fee includes costs associated with 4 inspections that will be completed throughout a 12-month period. It is also proposed that properties that continue to be owned by the same owners and receive second and subsequent orders will be charged a $476 administration fee. This fee will recover costs associated with enforcement of ongoing nuisance violations and provide incentive to owners to reduce the number of repeat violations. Since the property standards and lot maintenance bylaws do not require owners of vacant properties or buildings to register with the town is often not aware of them until the condition of the property generates a complaint. Responding to these complaints negatively impacts staff resources, as they often have to locate the owner, which prolongs enforcement efforts and unsightliness of the property. A vacant property registry bylaw would give staff more tools to ensure that these properties do not fall into disrepair or present a safety concern for the community, and would add appropriate fees and charges to problem property owners. So that completes my presentation for tonight, and I'm available for any questions council may have.
Thank you. I've got several, as you can see, and I just wonder if you want to explain where staff stand on the question of posting signage on these properties.
We do have we can remove that from the bylaw if council would like to. We have another recommendation that could be presented.
Thank you. So I'm going to start over here with Councillor Grant and go along the table. Councillor Grant?
Thank you.
Oh,
Through
there's
you.
another hand behind you. You
Signage
go
was
right
going to be my
ahead.
question.
We'll come to him at the end.
Signage was going to be my question, so we're going to take care of that fine. Again, if we're talking about stopping trespassing, having a property listed with a giant sign on it kind of says to me, come on in and squat today. So great, thank you.
The original intent of the sign was just for emergency situations where police may be called to the site and need to act quickly.
So, to be clear, if a home is boarded up, probably the sign wouldn't be the boards on the windows and doors would be doing the advertising for it's vacant. So maybe staff's proposal could be that where it's boarded up, a sign might very well be appropriate. And where it's not boarded up, perhaps a sign, might cause some anxiety about privacy and so on. So I'm gonna start down at this end and come this way. Who is first down here? Councillor O'Meara.
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you very much for this, John. I do have a number of questions here. I'll try and be brief. So if it is being taken care of and the house is empty, how are we going to find out that it's vacant?
We will be proactively monitoring for long grass, but if residents bring forward concerns about a vacant property, staff will initiate an investigation.
Okay, so that if they're taking care of their grass, we're not going to know whether they have insurance or whether, and then it's because we just would assume that somebody's taking care of it. Is that the genesis?
Correct.
Then? We've talked a couple times about permitting inspections. What does that entail? How many times do we get to inspect, and how do we get permission to inspect?
So currently, we do have permission to inspect any property under the building code. This just makes us do 4 mandatory inspections. So it's just to be proactive, and the fee does include 4 inspections.
Okay, now, and then, so I know that the repeat offenders, the fees will go up, but how do we get out of that cycle where the grass grows to 10 inches, we issue an order, we wait 30 days, they come and cut the grass at the end, and then it just starts all over again? How do we break that cycle?
So being proactive, we no longer will have to wait, and the order can be enacted immediately. With the property standards bylaw, we do have to wait 19 days for compliance or for the homeowner to do the work. Under lot maintenance, we don't have to provide the 19 days. It can be done immediately, within a couple of days.
So we'd be asking them to do it, right? Is that correct? In a couple of days?
If it's a problem property, we could do the work right away. The order could be for immediate, and we could do that right away.
And that, I guess the decision would be subjective upon our bylaw inspectors and the history of the property and deciding how we're gonna take it. Is that correct? then?
Correct, yes.
And then lastly, if they have an active building permit, that this would not count. What about demolition permits?
Any building permit or demolition permit would exempt them from this bylaw.
So someone could sit on a demolition permit for quite some time then and be exempt from this bylaw?
They could.
So maybe we can tweak that then, because I would hate to see that be a loophole that somebody gets through on.
Right.
Thank you. Thank you, your worship.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Duddick, are you next? Councillor Duddick.
Thank you. Two questions I have. One is, and I think my colleague might have spoken to someone offline about it, but vacationers, snowbirds, people who go away 5-6 months of the year, how do we deal with that in terms of them registering that they're not there monitoring the property?
I think the intent of the bylaw is for properties that are not maintained. So like we alluded to earlier, staff may not be aware if the property sits vacant. If it's completely maintained and there's never an issue. But essentially they would have to register if we were to become aware of it.
Sorry, I guess my concern is maybe during the winter, nobody cares if you plow the driveway or whatever. But I'm thinking in terms of excessive snowfall covering a gas outlet or something that may cause a problem as a result of too much snow. The other thing is, several people have raised the issue about security systems. Has any thought been given regarding fire, flooding, and it's similar to what was raised earlier, just to keep eyes on the property in terms of somebody trying to breach the outside of the unit?
Currently, there'd be no requirements to monitor the interior of the building, but I do believe some of that may be covered through their insurance policies. If they have it, that they would have to have regular visits to the house.
Is our inspection cover things like to make sure there's functioning smoke alarms, things of that nature, so that if somebody, I'm thinking a neighbor next door, if they hear something going off, maybe not as much as a security system, but we should make sure that they have, functioning smoke alarms.
So that's currently not in the vacant property registry bylaw, but I do believe working fire alarms are covered through fire prevention in some of their legislation.
All right. Councillor Chisholm.
Thank you, Worship. Page 39 of the report, the owner of the property, the building, after 90 days of vacancy would have to register, but there doesn't seem to be a deadline when they can register. That was brought up by one of our residents, and so I think that's something that we need to look at because they could drag this out so we should have some kind of a deadline on that. The other challenge I have, and is with respect to, and we've talked about it briefly, snowbirds and so forth. Maybe my speculation is that if the snowbirds are away for 3 or 4 months, I would assume they're maintaining their properties in good order and abiding to all the bylaws. So would they have to register at the $810 if they're away for, say, 4 months?
So potentially they would. In some instances, I believe some snowbirds will have people stay at their house for a weekend. And I wouldn't think that it would be vacant at that point.
So the suggestion would be if you're away for 4 months and you do not register, would they be in violation of the bylaw? Or the proposed bylaw?
I don't think they would be in violation as long as somebody were to be attending that property on a regular basis. However, if they didn't have somebody attending the property on a regular basis, then they would have to register.
And so we're clear, so the register would be after the 90 days,
Correct. Yeah.
correct? And there would, hopefully there will be a deadline when they need to register. Is that
You
correct?
got it, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Counselor Giddings?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I appreciate the description. So they're captured by definition. The issue is that they'll be complaint-based.
So the bylaw will be enforced proactively with regards to ensuring grass is cut. If there's a property that appears to be vacant, we will take action. But for the snowbirds, I think that'll be a difficult piece to do proactively. So that will most likely rely on complaints.
All right, I'm happy to see the willingness to drop the requirement for the sign. A number of my other colleagues just saw it as an advertisement. And also, what do you do with a condo building where a dozen families may be south and you're blocking the entrance with signs when there's no lawn to cut or snow to shovel? After a complaint or a property standards order is in place, do we have a way, or are you suggesting that you follow up with the registered owner, wherever they may be, to send them the paperwork and say, you know, we've got this on your property, please look after it and register so we can try to reduce the cycle of going back and back and back, time and time again?
Correct. So part of the requirements are to have the owner of the property provide their contact information, as well as secondary emergency contact information. So that if we do need to get in touch with anybody related to that property, we'd be able to somewhat immediately.
All right, and property standards, if it's just a grass issue or a junk on the lawn issue, our officers can go front yard, backyard. They have no way of peeking in the windows and ordering anything because of what they see inside the property.
Correct. We wouldn't be able to enter the building itself,
All right, thank
the
you.
home.
Counselor Hazat-Thiel?
So my colleagues have covered much of my questions and quandaries about this. So in the best practice research that you have done, was there any insights into how other municipalities deal with individuals who leave the country for 4 months for some sunshine, and how they might stagger their registration, or do they do anything, or did they identify they do anything?
The municipalities that we looked at didn't identify that they treated them differently. I am aware Hamilton does have a fairly successful program, and it does fund some of their staff. And that was implemented, I believe, around 2016 for Hamilton. But they don't differentiate from snowbirds.
Okay. Could you, and I'm aware of the time pressures with folks, but could you just walk us through how it actually will function? I register, I give you my 800 and some odd dollars, I give you my proof of insurance, et cetera, but how do we know when those inspections are going to be? How have we thought through that inspection process to get at the root of what the direction was, which is to ensure the properties are in good repair?
So what the proactive inspections will do, they'll be completed once every quarter. If the property is identified to be a problem property, or we receive multiple complaints outside of our one mandatory inspection every quarter, we will attend more frequently and then charge the homeowner for those additional visits beyond the 4 inspections.
So as a follow-up to that, what stops us today from, on the property standard side, having that repeated visit and escalation in cost, or to the negligent owner?
So currently, the property standards bylaw, I believe, does allow for a subsequent order fee of $100. However, with the property standards order, we are waiting a minimum of 19 days before any action can be taken. And a property standards order is also open to be appealed through the Property Standards Committee, and then again through the Superior Court.
Okay. And can you help us understand why we have to have 19 days in the property standards bylaw?
That's, the building code tells us that has to be a minimum. So it's 14 days plus 5 days for service.
Okay. So what I'm hearing you say is that one of the advantages of how it's currently drafted is that we could immediately take action if it was blatant.
That's correct, yeah.
Okay. My other question is around the proactive versus reactive. I'm actually hearing that we'll have some proactive inspections. The reality is the registration will be based on complaints or observations that a building or a residence is really not maintaining their property. Do I have that correct?
So municipal enforcement officers will be proactively identifying some properties that we have received complaints for in the past.
Okay.
So that will be kind of our proactive side to it. If we do notice properties in the community that appear vacant, we would also take action on those. But as always with all enforcement, we do encourage community involvement, and anything that's brought forward would be investigated.
Okay. I may have questions later.
Well, we'll come back to you. Are you next? I'm fine. Okay. I'm going over here then to Councillor Adams.
Thank you very much for the report. I have a few questions, some of which were touched on earlier. So with respect to vacationers and snowbirders, as we're calling them, if they don't register, would their fire insurance or other home insurance become void if a catastrophe were to fall upon their home while they're away and they haven't registered?
So we did speak to the Insurance Bureau of Canada, and they did mention, although typically during the summer, they're a bit more lax on that rule. In the winter, they do require somebody to be at the property to ensure they still have insurance.
So be at the property, I think I've heard various things around, you gotta have somebody come in every other day, or there's gotta be some frequency with which somebody has to be at the property to inspect, make sure that there's no frozen pipe and that sort of thing. How does that fit with our definition of what's vacant? When I read the definition, it says that it's a vacant building doesn't include a building where the owner satisfies the director that a use permitted under the town's zoning bylaws is occurring. So I'm imagining a detached home or a semi-detached home or a townhouse or maybe a condo or something. You know, if somebody is coming in every second day or every third day, does that meet the threshold of somebody who's using the property as it's intended as a single detached home?
Sorry, and I believe the insurance requirement, I know it varies per company, I believe.
Sure.
But I think it was 72 hours for the gentleman I spoke with. As long as the property is being used, I don't think it would be considered vacant.
So if somebody is having somebody drop by, a neighbor drops by their house every other day or every 3 days, whatever it is, to meet their own insurance requirements, is that meeting this proposed bylaw's definition of using the property as defined?
I would think so, yes. As long as the rest of the property was maintained, I think we would be well within the definition there.
And so all of these vacationers and snowbirds, almost every one of them I know, does some version of that and presumably wouldn't therefore need to register. Is that correct?
Correct, yeah.
So most of what we've talked about earlier kind of doesn't matter. It's a moot point with respect to most people in town. It would be the odd vacationer who shuts down their house and leaves for 6 months and never has a neighbor or friend or family member check on the house. That would be,
it becomes disrepair. Yeah.
that would be the kind of issue that we would be trying to catch. Very good. And then the last question I have for you is, if you did have somebody who registered and they are gone for 6 months, do they then just inform the town that they're back and they no longer have to have the inspections? Is that what happens?
No, the registry it's a 12-month period. So we would,
But if they're back and they're no longer vacant, they still have to have an inspection? Can't they shut down their?
no, we just, unfortunately, the fees wouldn't change.
But they
It would
don't
still be
need
the same.
But they don't need to have somebody come and inspect.
Correct, yeah. Correct, they wouldn't have to.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you for that, Counselor. Counselor Palmer?
Thank you for answering all of our questions. So just further to Counselor Adams' point, how would you know if somebody's coming to the house to check on it? So if I leave for 4 months and I'm simply just having someone maintain my house from outside, how would you know that, how would you satisfy that requirement?
So part of the, what we would do during an inspection is sometimes notices could be placed on the door. We leave door hangers to let residents know that we've attended the property. So there would be hopes that the person taking care of that property would notify us.
Okay, so just another scenario. So if I leave for 4 months, I did not register my property before I left, I'm maintaining it, I'm having it cleaned or my snow moved, whatever the case is, but somebody still complains, enforcement comes out, they see a maintained property, am I getting a ticket because I didn't register?
So that somebody would have to be staying there periodically to not be considered vacant. Because part of the requirement under the bylaws, it has to be maintained.
Okay,
So they,
so once you leave that first notice, within how many days? Is that the 19 days we talked about earlier?
so that's if we were to issue a property standards order,
Okay,
it's 19 days.
so back to the scenario then, if you came to that property because somebody complained and you would leave a notice, somebody would have to respond within how many days?
It would be dependent to what the officer provided them. If it's the first time we've been out to a call, the officer may provide a longer compliance time. If it's not the first time, the officer may provide,
Yeah, just some clarity around that, because, I mean, I could leave and then ask someone to visit every 2 weeks, but that might not meet the cutoff of getting back to the notice that's left at the door. Maybe somebody's coming every 3 weeks, or, so it would help to know that. And then I also, something's not adding up with the whole, if you leave for 4 months, you register your property, you come back, why would you pay $800 for 4 inspections a year when you don't need them? It doesn't really seem fair to me. We're not looking at any prorated or phasing in of those fees for somebody that's a snowbird?
So we have looked at the possibility of having less inspections. The initial bylaw was for 4, because that's what was asked for. But we have looked at the possibility of having 1 inspection,
Yeah.
2 or 3.
Or perhaps even when registering that I'll be away for X months, and if it's 6 months, then at least 1 inspection applies, and you're billed based on that, and further billed if you decide to stay longer. But to have to register $800 for 4 inspections and only be gone for 4 months doesn't really add up to me. So those are my comments on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Counselor. Counselor Liszczyna?
Thank you, Your Worship. I was hoping you could clarify, because as my understanding is, this report was asked by council in 2014.
Correct.
More than half of council wasn't here at that time. So there was a major issue with vacant housing. So you must have some stats since 2014, since we're at 2019, about how many properties are we talking in the last 5 years?
So for 2018, I could say we have 120 commercial properties that are vacant. For property standards issues, we had 150 calls that stated vacant in the description, but that wouldn't necessarily mean that the property.
So the call was for long grass?
It could have been in their description of the property was that it was vacant. So that was 150 calls.
So what kind of, if this bylaw was enacted, what kind of FTEs are we looking at for taxpayer money?
Currently, we don't believe there will be an impact for FTE. It would be.
So there's a lot of, we just talked about, there's a lot of snowbirds. That's a lot of houses that we would need to now put onto this register. That doesn't make sense to me either. Most of those people, as we know, take care of their properties and are very conscientious about that. So I'm coming back to 150 calls, and then the 120 commercial, like units in a plaza, or?
So it's just commercial properties. So that's tracked through municipal taxes. So that's how we know it's.
So what happened to these? In this, say in 2018, for these properties, we left them a note to cut their grass, or what happened?
If they weren't maintained, our department would get involved and possibly have grass cut, or anything in the property standards or lot maintenance bylaw may have been addressed.
Just when you started your, and I don't mean to be, I'm not trying to be mean here. When I looked at the initial house that's boarded up, I could see about infestation and things like that. But the majority of housing that we're talking about right now, including people who leave for 4 months, I'm sure don't reach that stage. And when you get people who complain, who say that there's an issue, you know, property standards, usually grass issues and bushes overgrown and that kind of thing. So I understand where the complaints are coming from. I'm trying to understand really the difference. There's a huge difference between a boarded up house and people who are going away for a few months, as Councillor Haslett-Theo said, for sunshine.
Thank you, Councillor. We're going to Councillor Adams for a deeper dive. The last time he was questioning Mr. Maddox, he brought out that snowboards whose property is complying with standards aren't caught by this. So the idea here is to get the bad guys, not the good guys, is what I was hearing. But Councillor Adams, why don't you see what you can do?
That is what I heard, but I just wanted to clarify because I then subsequently heard a slightly different use of wording of staying at a property is what you responded to a later question versus what I would describe as visiting a property or checking on a property where a neighbor comes to the property, looks around the outside, doesn't see any problems, might go inside, checks, make sure that no windows are broken, checks that no pipes are broken, that kind of thing. That would be a check on a property or a visit to a property as opposed to staying overnight, sleeping there at the property in a full usage of the residential property. Can you clarify for me that it's not required to sleep at a property overnight? It's satisfactory to be checking on a property in the way that most people would if they were away for a week or two, or possibly 3 or 4 or 5 months, having a neighbor check on a property.
I think Mr. Barry is going to address that part of the question.
Through you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you very much, Councillor, for your question. I think what we've heard tonight is there is actually some issues with the bylaw that we do need to address, specifically with this issue of what actually maintaining or ownership is to maintain that property. So I think there's probably enough issues that we don't want to draft regulations on the floor. And considering the bylaw was intended to come into effect in January, we do have some time to address those. So I know we've captured most of the comments, and I'd be certainly happy to answer any others or any other questions you have about it. But what we'd like to do is be able to go back and maybe bring this back in a month or so with a specific answer in the bylaw to those questions. So we have a cohesive piece of regulation for you.
Thank you, Mr. Barry. Before I ask for a motion to refer, I'd like to ask our 2 registered delegations if they're content with that approach, and you would then be able to come back and comment on whatever revision comes to council.
I thought I still had the floor.
Yes, hi. Elizabeth Chalmers for Joshua Creek Residents
So
Association.
I'm not asking you to
No, I know, I
delegate.
wanted to say, I am content with that, but I did want to say one thing, just to pull this back a little bit, which is, we also don't want to see homeowners who go away negatively impacted, but I do want to remind council that there is an impact for people who live near vacant homes or clusters of vacant homes, and that issue is also important and does need to be addressed, whether it's done in this bylaw or through a different bylaw. So, but otherwise, yes, happy to have very robust discussion. Thank you.
Okay, so you're happy to come back
Yes.
when something comes back. Councillor Adams, is there any chance that you're getting ready to move referral?
I'll happily move referral. I just want to add one more thing to our staff's list, and I think some of our colleagues have some additional questions. I just wanted to add to the list of items for our staff to consider when they come back, which is the defining how to prove someone is not checking on a property more specifically. So if imagine trying to charge somebody, they haven't checked on the property to our knowledge in 5 months, you put a charge on them, and they go, oh no, my neighbor checks on it every day. How do you make sure that that's actually not happening?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, I'll just add a little bit to that, and this is one of the common problems we have with these types of specifically long-term licenses. We've talked about this in some others. Short-term accommodation was one of those where we have to prove the negative. It becomes difficult because we have to spend a lot of time on what would be deemed actually surveillance of a property. So that is one of the difficult things.
Councillor Chisholm.
Thank you, Worship. Listening to the discussion, I think the challenge we're having is the titled vacant homes or vacant lots or so forth. There might be some clarity with respect to a very definitive detail on what we mean by vacant homes. You know, you can use the word derelict or whatever. The reality of it, what we're talking about here, is homes that are visually not within adhering to the bylaws and so forth. That's really the issue. I don't really believe if we have snowbirds leaving, they're going to register, because it would seem to me that they maintain their property, so that's the non-issue. That's, to me, is the non-issue. The issue is the visual, and I understand being proactive, but also there's got to be reactive with complaints and so forth. So I think the real issue is what we define as a vacant home, and that might be on the negative side of derelict home, whatever the case may be. My last question, and you might not have an answer for this, Jim, but the proposed bylaw imposing a tax on vacant properties. We can't do anything at that until the ministry designates the town of Oakville through a regulation to impose a tax. Are we moving in that direction with the Ministry of Finance to look at that as being Oakville being on the registry for that tax?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, I'll answer both of those. The derelict property, I believe that's a very good point, and we'll take that back as we go away and see if there's some way we can work that into the regulation. And it may be through a demerit point system of some sort that triggers something. So I think there are some options there that we can definitely look at. It may lengthen the enforcement process slightly, but may provide clarity around the entire regulation. So I think there's definitely some opportunity. With respect to the regulation by the minister, I don't believe that we are actively looking at that. I believe that was something that the ministry was supposed to come down and provide that, but I will look into that and we'll make sure we follow up on that in the next report.
Councillor Haslett-Teel.
I want to start and begin by thanking JCRA and Elizabeth Chalmers for coming out, and actually she's drafted some things, but I understand Ms. Lockwood is here and she is actually can articulate for you how horrific an experience it is to have a vacant property beside you and have somebody who doesn't respond. And so I think we should give her an opportunity to say her piece, because she has lived through some difficult moments.
Well, Councillor, I'll call her at the appropriate time.
I'm sure you would. I just thought I'd remind you that she's there.
Thank you. Ms. Lockwood, we'll get to you.
Okay.
Councillor Elger.
Thank you very much. I think Ward 4's probably got the longest number of years of a derelict house, where it built in the 80s, person never moved into it, and finally got resolved, because finally they didn't pay their taxes after 30 years. But we need something, and something that they can actually get control. But my concern is, you talk about a person leaves, so you've got a security system. You're set up for fire. You know if somebody's come through the door. You know if the glass has been broken, and you got cameras everywhere. How does that enter into it? You don't get involved unless there's an issue of looking at the outside, correct?
Through Mr. Mayor, that's traditionally the way it's been. With respect to the internal operations of a property, we're trying to stay as much away from that. We don't want to build a ton of bureaucracy into this bylaw. I mean, that we start to make a bylaw that feeds on itself and is very difficult to manage. I think from its purest nature, Councillor Chisholm said this probably the best, in that we're really just looking after derelict. The intent is to look after derelict properties, the properties that the residents in the neighborhood see and know that something has to be done with. This bylaw was certainly an opportunity to do that. There are different ways. We're hearing some great opportunities from council, we'll take that back and see if we can't come back with something that addresses just like that property on.
Yeah, I think you're aware of it.
I'm quite aware of that, yes.
Thank you.
Councillor Knoll?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This has been a great conversation so far. Most of the issues I had have been resolved or spoken about already, but I just want to explore the sign issue just a little bit more. It seems there's a universal opinion that that's not a starter, but I'm curious why that's in the bylaw. Because I haven't heard your justification for it. And is this something that is employed in other jurisdictions? To me, intuitively, it makes sense. I know that many of the issues I've had with vacant properties in my ward are boiled down to the fact that neighbors can't contact the owners of the homes for, I know one that happened during the winter, somebody noticed there was water running out of the garage and there was no way to reach anybody, so finally we had to call Halton, get them to shut off the water. But a phone call or an email might have made some difference. So I'd like to know why that was in the bylaw instead of just dismissing it as saying we don't want to do it. I'd like to understand if there's justification for it. Because maybe the issue isn't a sign on a stake on the front lawn. Maybe it's a small, discrete sign on the door. So there's always a place where police or utility providers or whatever can get a hold of something instead of trying to track down a bylaw officer on a Sunday at 2 a.m.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, to Councillor Knoll, that the reason for the regulations, sorry, I'll start and say other municipalities do have it in their bylaws. Our reasoning for it is exactly that. We were trying to, what we often hear is exactly that. If I knew how to contact that person, I would just call them, tell them something's wrong, and they would fix it. So this was the attempt at doing that. Do understand that, you know, it can be that picture that it can't actually paint a picture unto itself that the property is vacant. So I think we can take that away as well and look at when that sign is used, and maybe there's opportunity to still have it, but not in every case.
And when you do look at that, look at potentially, because I think the thing that, I mean, it stuck out to me, it was alarming that it was literally like a for sale sign on the front lawn. Or it's, you know, for squatting sign ultimately is what the bylaw looked like. But if there could be something, even consider this more discreet. So if somebody's specifically looking for it, it's in a standard place in every home, but it's not a flag as a potential squatter's driving by. Thank you, Worship.
Thank you, Councillor Knoll. Council, are you exhausted of questions? All right. Ms. Lockwood, we're going to consider this matter again. Our procedure bylaw says that you get one shot at it. Do you want to save your shot for when it comes back? Do you want to speak now? I believe council is going to ask staff to conduct more public consultation, which will be another chance. So if you'd like to delegate, you're welcome to. I just want to indicate to you that you have other options.
Yeah, I think I'll speak tonight.
Welcome.
Okay, so I wanted just to bring attention to a vacant property that we have had beside us for over 4 years. In the last 2 years, it's gotten much worse. We have gone through the process and are in that never-ending process of a sign going on the door. The problem with the property is there has been no owner in or out of that house in a number of years. It appears that the house has been either subletted or rented out to a construction company who now uses it as storage. So if I can paint a picture of what happens every day at 6 a.m., 2 workers show up. They park their personal vehicles in the driveway. They get in their Canadian concrete and stone truck. They load it up with construction materials from the garage, and they go off to work for the day. They come back every day at 5 o'clock. They unload their construction materials into the garage. Then they get into, they change in the driveway, as my children have told me. And then they get into their personal vehicles and they drive away. So I have been in constant contact with the bylaw officers. I know them by name and I have their numbers on speed dial. And they come and they put a sign on the door. The problem is nobody ever enters or they don't see the sign on the door. So when I show you these photos, I'm going to show you, the grass is up past my hips. It is up to the fence. It was recently cut. my understanding, is hired by the town of Oakville. Finally, somebody came and did. There is garbage strewn about. There is buckets of recycling bins in the backyards that are full of water and garbage. And more recently, I have had confirmation from my pest control that there are rats in my garage. So, you can see that there's evidence that this is happening in our garage. And yeah, it's very frustrating. So I don't know, can I show you the photos?
Yes, and which one is yours?
It says 129 Claxton.
Give me 1 second. They think you have a photo.
Okay. So anyways, we've gone through the process. I feel like we've sort of done our due diligence. We've done everything that we can. We see coyotes and foxes. They all go into the backyard and they walk out very happily because they've obviously found what they're looking for. We just don't know. When you ask the construction guys, they don't know who the owner of the house is. They say they're just being told. They're just doing what they're told. This is just an assumption on my part, but it appears that they have almost subleased or rented this space, so they just kind of come and go. Yeah, so.
Property?
Yes.
Presentation?
Yes.
John, right?
Nope.
No, okay. That's, do you know what the name of yours is? Top left. This one here.
Yes.
That's item 3. Okay, so.
Okay, so if I show you the first photo,
So all you have to do is.
is just arrow? Okay. So this is what I can see from my driveway. So you can see those big bins, there's garbage everywhere. Currently, that bin is now full of water and has garbage floating in it. So this is our view from our driveway. This is the backyard. So on the left side, backs onto our property. So you can just see that pile of stone sitting there. That is a pretty big pile of stone, but you can see how high the weeds are and how overgrown it is. Things just falling apart. There's debris everywhere. This is the front. To be honest, it really doesn't do it justice. It's pretty bad. And I did take a notice. We've gone through this. I wait the 19 days. I just want to make a point that when I went in to check the expiry date on this, there is truck and car tires in the living room. So I don't know who's storing them there. I don't really understand, but you can see it clearly. They're using it as some sort of a storage. This is the backyard. And again, more garbage. You can see it's all sort of floating in there. And the stone that's sitting there, so they do come each day and they collect that stone and they go to work. I just want to make it clear that no work is being done on this property. So I do not believe there is a work order or, it's definitely not snowbirds. It's just a vacant property. Again, just the notice. And so this is the backyard. Again, you can see the weeds at the back are almost as high as the fence. So for me, for 4 years, I feel like we have been pretty patient with this. When my pest guy said there is signs of rats, I would go out to my garbage and they would not be knocked over, but yet they were completely eaten through. All my garage doors were shut. So it's too much for a mouse, but obviously a raccoon can't get in there. So, and he could see signs of rats. So he went and looked next door, and there's a massive wood pile apparently on the far side of the building, and he thinks that's where they are living. So I don't know. In our opinion, I don't believe that our street is zoned for a construction warehouse. So we've been here 12 years. This has never been an issue. There was a great little old lady that lived here, and when she moved out, it has changed ownerships 3 to 4 times, and this is what's left. So.
So that's your information?
that is my information.
Thank you very much. I think Councillor Chisholm has a question for you.
Okay.
I'm not sure if it's a question, Tricia, but there seems to be a trend in some of the residential areas where they're using what I call staging. And it's construction companies. I believe what they're doing is staging, bringing materials, taking out, parking their trucks, taking their cars, and using this as a staging area. The reason I think they're doing it, because they're saving money. They don't have to go miles away to do. So I think this is a challenge we're having in our municipality, especially in Ward 2. I've seen we have a couple of those same situations where it's more of a construction staging, and I don't believe it falls within the zoning. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chisholm. Councillor Duddick.
Thank you, through your worship. Not of yourself, and I so sympathize with what you're experiencing, but maybe I could ask of staff that we look at this issue of utilizing residential properties for business other than what it's properly zoned for. I don't know if it'll be caught under this, but maybe it's something our zoning and planning can also look at.
Thank you, Councillor. Ms. Lockwood, I feel your distress, and I have to tell you that we need to fix this. We totally accept that, and we thank you for your graphic presentation. It brings it home, and I hope it will lend some urgency for council and staff to deal with it. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you.
All right, so council, I think it's decision time. Councillor Hazlett-Teal. With public consultation?
With an additional public consultation.
And is that satisfactory? I see it looks like satisfactory. Is staff going to be able to handle that? And do you want to, I wonder if we want a return date. Could you do this in 2 months?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, I would suggest September.
All right. So Councilor Hazard-Thiel, do you want a return date on this?
Well, I'd like it always sooner rather than later, but we want to get it right. And so if the first council meeting in September, if that's what staff are saying they can do, and that would include consultation having been completed? She asks.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, yes, in September, we'll bring back a revised bylaw and we'll have had public consultations.
Councillor Adams?
I wondered if I could suggest it come through one of our subcommittees in September so that we have the chance between a subcommittee meeting and a council meeting to make a minor amendment should we wish. It might help the process.
Commissioner, do you agree with diverting this out of the planning and development cycle into administrative services, perhaps?
Or CSC, either
Or
committee.
CSC.
I agree that that would be a good place to have this discussion. It would also give us a little bit more time to maybe have the consultation right at the 1st of September, rather than holding it during the summertime. So I think the meeting for community services is the week after P&D, so it gives us one additional week to then report.
Thank you. Councillor, are you okay with that? So you're referring it to staff to bring back to CSC at the first meeting in September, if I'm following all that.
That would be acceptable, and then with a clear message that if we get calls, which I know, I mean, the staff have already gone out and done some work on Ms. Lockwood's property, and the clear message, dial Service Oakville ASAP, and we'll get out in the summer to deal with the property standards violations as best we can.
All right, is it understood? And may I call the vote? All those in favor? Opposed, if any? That's carried. Thank you, everybody. Number 4 is the Club Link Court application to quash bylaw 2018-15, official plan amendment 24, and to quash bylaw 2018-16, zoning bylaw amendment for the Glen Abbey property. And we have a presentation available from Dennis Perlin, our assistant solicitor.
Thank you, Your Worship, and members of council. This report is in the nature of a procedural report that's in front of you this evening. ClubLink, amongst its many actions, has taken broad applications to quash the designation bylaw that was before you in the past. This relates to the two new planning instruments that were created with respect to the Glen Abbey Golf Course property, complementing the work that was done in the planning under the interim control bylaw, and also complementing the designation as a heritage cultural landscape. Because of the time element, an appearance was put in terms of indicating the council would respond to this application to quash. This particular report in front of you is to formally obtain a confirmation of the action that was taken by staff with respect to responding to the application in that manner in a timely way. And secondly, to seek authority to carry on with the opposition to this, to the application when it comes forward. The timing in terms of the application will be some time away, in the sense that the likelihood of the prosecution of the application is not until the Court of Appeal has dealt with the other two matters that were in front of it a few weeks ago, and until the decision is rendered. So that's really what's here, confirmation of the appearance, and secondly, to provide for retaining outside counsel that is now dealing with the designation one as well, to deal with the application in opposition to the application to quash when the matter is brought forward to the courts.
Thank you, Mr. Perlin. Councillor Duddeck?
I'd be pleased to move the item.
Let me just poll the public. Are there members of the public with information for council on this matter? Going once, going twice, seeing none. Councillor Duddeck, your motion's in order. Is there discussion? Shall I put the vote? A recorded vote. To be recorded in favor, please rise to be named. Councillor O'Meara, Councillor Robertson, Councillor Duddeck, Councillor Chisholm, Councillor Giddings, Councillor Hazlet-Thiel, Councillor Elgar, Councillor Longo, Councillor Knoll, Councillor Grant, Councillor Adams, Councillor Lischina, Councillor Palmer, and Councillor Sanju, and Mayor Burton. I declare the matter carried unanimously. Thank you, everybody. We now have the recommendation report and zoning bylaw amendment and plan of subdivision for Oakville Green Development, Inc., which is part of Lot 25, Concession 1. And we have a report from our senior planner, Mr. Paul Barrett. Mr. Barrett, we are all ears. Also, Council, we have registered delegations.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and members of council. A zoning bylaw amendment and draft plan of subdivision application were submitted by Oakville Green Development, Inc., and the staff report can be found on page 11 of tonight's addendum. The subject lands are located east of the Oakville Trafalgar Memorial Hospital and form part of a larger land holding by Oakville Green. The draft plan of subdivision proposes to divide the subject lands into 3 blocks, reshape the Glen Oak Stormwater Management Pond, which is currently owned by the town, and provide 1 new public road extending from the hospital entrance along 3rd Line through the site to the future William Halton Parkway. The zoning bylaw amendment proposes to permit 4 15-story buildings inclusive of a hotel and conference center, medical office, retirement home, and an employment use building with ground floor retail, and 2,344 underground parking spaces. Total floor area proposed is approximately 1 million square feet. At the April 15th Planning and Development Council meeting this year, Council deferred consideration of this application pending completion of a town-initiated peer review of the information submitted by White Oaks, a transportation sensitivity analysis, and a scoped financial impact analysis. These matters have been addressed as follows. Firstly, Council may recall that White Oaks, who's the owner of lands approximately 570 meters to the east, raised concerns regarding the subject development applications with respect to interference with radio signals, public health and safety, that is during construction and post-construction, and radio interference with construction equipment and consumer electronics. The town-initiated peer review of the White Oaks and Oakville Green submissions is now complete. Public health and safety matters were thoroughly reviewed and no concerns were found regarding compliance with Health Canada's Safety Code 6, which sets limits to ensure public safety. However, given the risk of electrical shocks from induced and contact current during construction on long metallic objects such as construction cranes, as a condition of approval, the owner would be required to prepare and agree to implement a construction mitigation plan to address related safety concerns during construction. Concerns of electric shocks diminish after construction. However, staff are recommending a warning clause regarding such nuisances, including potential interference with some consumer electronics. While the secondary plan provides for urban development to replace the radio transmission operation in the fullness of time, distortions to the radio station pattern shapes caused by the proposed buildings during this interim period were found to be relatively minor and able to be mitigated on-site through adjustments. In absence of clear direction from the federal regulatory authority, precedent, or policy direction, staff does not propose to assign responsibility for proposed mitigation measures to either the developer or the radio station as a condition of approval. As outlined in more detail in the staff report, Oakville Green is encouraged to engage in discussions with White Oaks to identify potential mitigation measures that may ensure that the design and construction of any building to limit potential impacts on the radio signal or pattern and establish a set of test points to test from time to time to evaluate possible degradation of the radio signal and pattern resulting from construction of the buildings. It is noted that through site plan control, the possibility of on-site mitigation measures will be evaluated and may be required if they are appropriate. In this respect, staff have no concern with respect to the feasibility of the proposed development. With respect to the White Oaks comment letter dated June 9th, 2019, that Council may have received, staff have reviewed that letter and no change to the height, the location, or timing of the development is warranted in staff's view. Secondly, as Council may recall, as part of the update report considered by Council on the 15th of April, staff had concerns that the Oakville Green Transportation Impact Study may be underestimating the number of vehicle trips given the proposed employment density and reliance on unfunded public transit. Staff recommended that the applicant prepare a transportation sensitivity analysis to address these concerns. Staff have reviewed the Oakville Green submissions, and the surrounding transportation network can sustain an additional 1,000 total peak hour two-way site vehicle trips during the interim period until William Halton Parkway is constructed between Third Line and Nayagawa Boulevard. At that time, the full Phase 1 development, as proposed by Oakville Green, could be supported. Accordingly, it is necessary to coordinate construction of a portion of the development as part of a holding provision with the availability of new transportation infrastructure to provide for existing transportation infrastructure to operate at an acceptable level of service. This is especially important in this location as there is a public interest in ensuring timely access to the hospital by emergency vehicles and the public. Practically, this means one building would be held back until William Halton Parkway is operational between Third Line and Neyagawa Boulevard, which is estimated to be 2022. Lastly, a better understanding of the financial impact of the proposed development to the town was identified as necessary in the update report. Staff have reviewed the Oakville Green scoped financial impact study, and based on staff's analysis, staff estimate that the resulting financial impact to the town would be approximately $5.9 million in capital costs and $1.2 million in operating costs. And that would be in the scenario where all 12 new buses are purchased and operating, which is the year 2031. These costs would likely need to be funded from the reserves and tax levy. However, by coordinating phasing of the development with available transportation infrastructure through the proposed holding provision, this is expected to mitigate the projected shortfalls in funding capital and operating impacts to the town triggered by the proposed development. Under this interim period of relatively lower level of transit service, the financial impact to the town could be significantly mitigated and possibly eliminated if no new buses are purchased. The decision to purchase new buses and the resulting financial considerations would rest with council through the annual budget process, where these matters would be considered on a more comprehensive basis. The staff report also completes the technical review of the application and largely implements the anticipated resolution of remaining matters as contemplated in the update report considered by council on the 15th of April. While the resolution of each matter is detailed more in the staff report, overall, all remaining matters have been addressed. However, I would like to draw your attention to one matter that was of interest to council, and that's parking. In absence of a parking justification report supporting an appropriate parking standard for the proposed development, the site-specific bylaw proposes a higher minimum parking standard. However, once the design of the development has advanced and more details are available, the owner would have the ability to submit a parking justification study as part of a minor variance application and request a more suitable parking standard. Overall, staff are recommending approval of the draft zoning bylaw amendment and draft plan of subdivision as revised for the reasons outlined in the staff report. In conclusion, Your Worship, staff put forth the following recommendations as shown for council's consideration. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett, for your thorough report. Councilor Elgar.
Thank you very much for the report. I guess if you really take a look at the reports we have here, we've got one that comes in from the White Oaks Telecommunications Group under the lawyer saying at the last paragraph, we respectfully request confirmation from the town that it will be requiring the detailed modeling and mitigation plan before approving of the proposed development, together with appropriate condition of draft approval that will ensure the mitigation plan is carried out and appropriate warning clauses and agreements of purchase and sale. Now, then we did the peer review. So if you read the peer review from Stantec, it's pretty interesting. They say it is prudent, however, to further, first of all, they go through all the reasons why it's just fine. Then they say it is prudent, however, to further investigate the potential impact that the 4 proposed 15-story structures will have on the radio station's licensed radio pattern and to the contact currents at the actual building locations. So they're actually saying the same thing, that the details should be done before this is approved. So I'm wondering, and also if you read the whole report, and from the lawyer, they say also that the towers should be moved. That's the real way to solve the problem. Because we know that when they were doing the 16-mile bridge at Dundas, that the electronics blew up on a couple of different machines, totally, fried everything and fried cables. I don't know why we would go forward and do anything at this point until we have the detailed information. Because when you read about pacemakers, garage doors opening and closing, like the report we have, you've given us all the information, and it's pretty good. And I know, you really got to watch the words in Stantec's report too, because they've given themselves a complete out by stating it would be prudent. And they're going and saying exactly what the White Oaks Communications is saying should be done. I just, why are we going forward approving anything until the details are given to us? These could be people's lives at stake here.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, the town's peer review consultant did review in great detail the public health and safety matters, and there's no concern with respect to compliance with the Health Canada Safety Code 6. In fact, the peer reviewer did find that the area of influence with respect to Safety Code 6 would be on about 19 meters from the towers, which would be roughly on the White Oaks property, essentially. So it's far removed from the Oakville Green site when you put it into the larger context.
So why did Stantec, in their report, which is not anything interpreted, it is actually their Stantec report, state that it would be prudent to further investigate the potential impact of these 4 15-story buildings and the impact they're going to have? Why did they put that in their statement?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, so the Stantec report was prepared for Oakville Green development in support of their development. And the town's peer review consultant found that while there could be impact on the pattern distribution of the radio station, it would likely be minor, and it could be addressed through on-site adjustments. There's no question with respect to the feasibility of the location or the height of the buildings that was raised through the town's peer review.
So Stantec, who did the peer review for the town?
It was a...
It's here.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, it was Octave Communications, who the principal is a professional engineer who specializes in these matters across Canada.
So Stantec, who say we should do it. The other company that White Oaks Communications said it had to be done. We're saying we don't need to.
Through you, Mr. Mayor.
Wow. Okay.
As part of the peer review, not only did the peer review consultant review planning of the surrounding area in the context of the whiteout concerns, but they also did review the Stantec report, and they did find a number of issues with that report. And that's an appendix to the peer review, which is, I believe, Appendix D of the staff report in front of council.
Well, there's so many other things in this report. There's a lot of doublespeak. So I appreciate what you're saying, but I definitely am concerned about human health here. Thank you.
Councillor Giddings.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you, during your presentation, you talked about the satisfying of Safety Code 6, the federal regulations, and that there are warnings over safety concerns during construction, and that those are dissipate or disappear once construction is complete. Is that a result of the cranes not being there, the large metal structures? How is that dissipated?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, that is my understanding. There wouldn't be large metal objects that are very long, like a crane cable or a crane structure, that'd be present after construction, which would help mitigate the shock hazard.
So, yet once the construction's complete, it's suggested that warnings are on title or during the sales process, correct?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, yes, through the sales process, prospective purchasers would be warned, and it would also be registered on title for subsequent purchasers.
So that's not a suggestion, that would be a requirement.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, that's correct.
You also spoke about dealing with concerns at site plan, and that the party was encouraged to speak with White Oak regarding mitigation.
That's correct.
I'm just wondering why it's suggested rather than that they must.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, to Councillor Giddings. The way that we've looked at this overall approval is staff have satisfied themselves that we've met the planning requirements. So it meets Safety Code 6. All of the requirements to ensure that is in place are in place. We have then ensured that through the site plan process, ways to but let me back up. We've also identified it's feasible to build these buildings, construction, and to have them up and running while still maintaining the radio station and providing for the safety of the workers that are on the site. The third thing I think that we've done is we've looked at, and this would be through the site plan process, the mechanisms that an applicant will put in place to do that. But beyond that point, it isn't until you get into the very detailed drawings of your building permit that you'll really understand the mitigation. And a lot of the mitigation is in relation to how their radio waves are distributed, which is really a business decision. So from the town's perspective, we looked at safety. We know it's feasible. We've put in place, they have to provide us how in which they'll do that at a very large or a high level. But the implementation of that is then left up to the developer, and they're really responsible for maintaining that as they would as a neighbor of another business. So that's the mechanisms that we've satisfied ourselves, that the town has done their due diligence in making sure that these buildings can exist with the radio station.
I appreciate the additional details. So it would be a far more robust site plan meeting than we often see.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, that's correct.
And that would be dealing with building styles, materials, built form.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, that's correct. At a high level, there could even be warning clauses embedded in the site plan agreement, which is registered on title.
I'm just looking for some assurance that it'll be a robust enough process that forget about the warnings, but the construction and the building of these units will be safe.
Given the information we've had from our peer review, we as staff were satisfied that it is a robust enough process. It's also a process which really recognizes the town's role in this, because there is a responsibility of the developer and the AM radio station to figure out a lot of those issues too. That is not a role of the town. So we've ensured that we've addressed all issues, and this is a robust way in which to ensure that the development will be safe in the end.
All right, and last question, the encouragement to meet with White Oak, would that be done prior to site plan approval, I trust?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, that's correct. Earlier the better.
Thank you.
Councillor Longo?
Through you, Your Worship. Just a quick question, because I went through the reports, and I'm by no means an engineer. I went through the Lehman report in 1993. In Appendix 1, it talks about susceptible equipment. So there's a list of equipment that talks about, things like electro-explosive devices, vehicle ignitions, vehicle brakes, heart pacemakers, medical monitoring equipment, medical test equipment. So that in 1993, cars didn't have the same electronics that they do today. So I went through that, and then I went through the Octave Communication, which is the peer review, I think, of Stantec. And they mention that on page 197, they actually talk about, and they say, impact on consumer electronics. And they don't specifically, they call out medical devices, and they don't talk about the electro-explosive devices. They don't talk about heart pacemakers per se, but they're all saying that it's safe, that they're safe according to what they've done in their tests of what Stantec and what Lehman did. Is that correct?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, while theoretically possible, these concerns, they need to be put into context in terms of how far away sites are removed from the radio towers, and through my understanding, also what direction the signals are going in. And I think the peer reviewer did a good job at putting those concerns into context. And within the peer review report, on page 14, there's figures in the report where they did their own independent analysis and provided essentially zones of influence for the radio towers and how they could impact electronics. And for instance, the impact to life-sustaining medical devices, that impact, given the signal strength of the White Oaks radio stations, it's very close to the towers. It's not close to the Oakville Green site.
So the risk then is distance, where there's a hospital, where there's the new buildings, where I believe there'll be seniors, pacemakers, medical devices, in their opinion, will not be impacted by the radio interference.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, that's correct. That is their opinion. They think that what could be impacted by the radio signals is inexpensive consumer electronics, possibly garage door openers, or very old consumer electronics that don't meet current standards.
Thank you.
Councillor Palmer?
Thank you. Just to shift gears a bit here, I have a question about the transit. So if we stuck with the 7% modal split and council doesn't account for any budget towards new buses, can we still meet that with our current budget?
Through you, Mayor Burton. So if we stick with the 7% mode split, there is at most a 2-bus impact that we would need to get. We could go with it. The analysis shows that it could be 0 buses or at most 2. Some additional analysis would need to be done to determine which routes the transit users from Oakville Green would take. But it was a range between 0 and 2 buses.
So we would have the resources to meet that 7%?
That's right.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Duddick?
Thank you, through you, Your Worship. I listened very closely when you were talking about the warning clauses, and I guess my confusion here is why have a warning clause if you're not concerned about something? So if there's a concern, you're going to have a warning clause. So that sort of is in opposition to what you're saying to us. There's not a problem. We've had it gone through our peer review. There isn't an issue, and yet you're insisting on having a warning clause. What is the warning clause precisely in addressing?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, the warning clause is in relation to a nuisance concern. The shock, the peer reviewer found it wouldn't be life-threatening. It would be similar to a static electricity shock. It would be at that level. And the risk to impact to consumer electronics on the Oakville Green site, and this could be different on other sites within the area, it's relatively low. And again, it would be older consumer electronics or inexpensively made ones. So that it's more of a nuisance.
Okay, that helps. The other question I have is, usually when we are looking at a development, and we often say, have the high density go in first before you have the stable residential neighborhoods. Why is the onus being put on the business that was there previously, White Oaks, to have a responsibility when it's the other party that's asking for the zoning amendment? I don't understand the rationale.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, so obviously White Oaks was there first. They could have participated in part of the secondary plan process as well, which did establish the high level land use permissions for not only their site, but the lands around that site as well. And as outlined in the staff report, in the fullness of time, the plan does contemplate that the White Oaks operations would at least cease operations on this site, perhaps be moved elsewhere, and urban development would replace it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Barrett.
Councillor Sanju.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, staff, for your report. A question about the holding provisions and how transit would work in that area. Understanding how the BRT is going to be constructed and operational later on down the road, I want to ensure that we have, or at least the folks that are going to be working in that area are going to have the ability to get to work on a regular basis. Can you talk to me a little bit more about how we're managing traffic flow, how that design works with the holding provision, the BRT, et cetera?
So through you, Mr. Mayor, the holding provision was drafted intentionally to contemplate a lower level of transit being provided. So even if for instance, the 15% modal split isn't achieved, it means that intersections around the hospital would still be operating at an acceptable level, and there wouldn't be undue impact from the proposed development on the surrounding transportation network. And that's one of the reasons why part of the development is being held back, and really just to keep pace with the availability of transportation infrastructure being built, namely William Halton Parkway in this case.
So in this situation, we're not putting the cart before the horse. So thank you very much for that. I appreciate it.
Councillor Knoll.
Thank you, Worship. Taking us back to radio frequencies for a moment, I'm just reviewing the contours for both CJYE and CJMR. And you mentioned something earlier, and that's why I went back to the drawings. You said it depends on where the signal's tuned. And I note on both these drawings, both these contours, the signal is clearly tuned to the east as opposed to the west. So my question is this: we as a corporation have had experience building in one of the highest zones for our recreation center at 60 Mile Creek, for example. Were there any precautions taken? Were there any incidents as a result of that construction? And also, has there been any consideration to talking to, or have we talked to St. Vladimir's, for example, across the street? Have they had RF issues? Were there issues during the construction of that? And further note that there's quite a few residences within the contours, single-family dwellings within both Ward 4, Ward 5, and Ward 7. Have we had any concerns issued? Have there been any mitigation measures taken in any of those wards over the years?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, to Councillor Knoll. We had no issues actually when we had built the 16-mile complex. We haven't spoken to Vladimir's at all. But we understand that the impacts are really felt when you get in a building form up above the 4 stories or even more than that. So it's not likely that we would feel it. And in fact, when the subdivisions were approved to the south of Dundas, way back when West Oak Trails, there had been a fair amount of work done by staff and consultants looking at where that impact was felt. And Industry Canada was involved in that work as well. And at the end of the day, they signed off because none of those buildings are greater than the 4-story limit. So it didn't create that issue.
So while I fully appreciate and respect and support the safety initiatives, I just want to make sure that we're clearly comparing apples to apples in terms of risk here too, so that I think so that everybody understands what it is. There are higher than 4-story buildings in those contours. In our ward, in Ward 5, there are 4 of them. There are 4 13-story buildings within the contour, for example. And again, I was very involved in being in touch with those developers. I've never heard issues in those buildings either. So great on the safety involvement, but I'm trusting what I'm reading here and even what I'm seeing with my own eyes, that I think that all the risks have been mitigated. So thank you for that work.
Thank you. Madam Clerk, I think you can call the listed delegations.
The first delegate is Eldon Theodore from MHBC Planning, Urban Design and Landscape Architecture.
Mr. Theodore, welcome. Council looks forward to your information.
sick of myself. Thank you, Mr. Mayor and members of the committee. Eldon Theodore from MHBC. I'm not going to be too long. What I wanted to speak on the staff report, and I wanted to speak briefly on the recent submission that came in. And I wanted to touch a bit on Councillor Elgar's comments. First, I wanted to commend staff on a very thorough staff report that really dissected a lot of the issues that were raised at the last meeting in April. Very comprehensive and very inclusive. And for clarity, we support staff's recommendations and the conditions that have been applied with respect to this development. With respect to the submission that was provided by Meridian Planning on behalf of White Oaks Communication, I just wanted to state that with respect to the peer review that was undertaken, we made a submission, White Oaks made a submission, the town undertook an independent peer review. We accept the fact that that is an independent review and it is without bias, and we are happy to accept their recommendations with respect to moving forward, knowing that it is impartial and it is on behalf of the town. Meridian's submission spoke to matters that are not directly related to compatibility, and I will just leave it at that. And with respect to the comment about the recommendations of Stantec's report, I can say that the recommendations at the end were what we anticipated that would be undertaking as part of the site plan application, something that staff would hold us to anyways as part of the approval process, where we look at and we determine whether there's any impact, because you need the detailed design of the buildings in order to undertake that. The framework and the conditions as placed within staff's recommendations in both the draft approval and the holding provisions obtain that objective. We know we're not, it's not the end of the road with respect to that mitigation, and we know that the detailed design will be able to articulate any measures, and we plan to work with White Oaks Communication to ensure that that matter is addressed. And I also want to note that if there are any questions about how we approach the parking internally, we have prepared a presentation. We are accepting of staff's recommendation of the additional parking spaces that are being required as part of this development. And if you're interested, we can show you how we intend that parking to be managed on site as part of an overall, obviously preliminary stage of operation of consolidated parking within the overall development. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Theodore, for your information. Are there questions for Mr. Theodore? Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Madam Clerk, the next delegation.
Next delegation is Brett Sears from WSP.
Mr. Sears, welcome. Council looks forward to your information.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor and members of council. Brett Sears from WSP. We're a consultant working with the proponent. I'm specifically involved with the transportation. I just wanted to thank the town staff. We've been working very, very closely with transportation engineering and planning. And we put forward to have this delegation just in case we had anything else we wanted to say, but because of our good relationship and our back and forth, we've actually settled the different items that we had a little bit of a concern with. So we do support the town's recommendation and have looked forward to the next steps working with the town. That's all I have to say.
Well, thank you for that. Questions for the gentleman? Thank you, sir. Are there other members of the public with information for council on this matter? Madam Clerk, I see none. Council, it's time to make a decision. Councillor Sandu.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just a quick comment before we go for motions. I wanted to thank staff for the amount of time that they put in on this, and I also wanted to thank the team that has been working on this from a private perspective. I know that you took mine, Councillor Palmer's, and the rest of councillors' comments into consideration when you decided to come back to us with your additional report, so we sincerely appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Still time to make a decision. Someone has to move something. Councillor Sandu.
I'll move. Thank you.
Councillor Sandu is moving the recommendation by staff.
Recorded vote, please.
Alrighty. Is there discussion? Shall I put the vote? To be recorded in favor, please rise to be named. Councillor O'Meara, Councillor Robertson, Councillor Chisholm, Councillor Giddings, Councillor Hazleteel, Councillor Longo, Councillor Knoll, Councillor Grant, Councillor Adams, Councillor Lischina, Councillor Palmer, Councillor Sanju, and Mayor Burton. To be recorded in the negative, please rise to be named. Councillor Duddick and Councillor Elgar. It's close, but it carries. Thank you, everybody. Now, Council, we have the recommendation report and zoning bylaw amendment for 393 Dundas, and we have a presentation from our manager of current planning, Mr. Charles McConnell.
Thank you, Mayor Burton and members of council. This presentation will provide an overview of the recommendation report for the zoning amendment application affecting 393 Dundas Street West, which can be found on page 217 of tonight's agenda. As you may recall, the subject lands are located on the north side of Dundas Street West, east of Gladeside, and west of George Savage. The application proposes to permit a mixed-use development that includes a 10-story mixed-use building containing 290 units and 275 square meters of ground floor commercial space and 15 three-story stacked townhouse units. The purpose of the zoning amendment application is to rezone the lands from the existing ED zone to Dundas Urban Core, or DUC, and to the Natural Heritage System zone. So I think this is just... Staff had originally recommended approval of the application at the February 11th, 2019 Planning and Development Council meeting, wherein the item was deferred so as to address the following issues: on-site parking, the amount and management of parking provided on-site, on-street parking, the availability of on-street parking, transit, the availability of existing and future transit along Dundas Street West, and bonusing, the status and potential benefits of bonusing. After the February P&D meeting, the applicant worked diligently to find opportunities and solutions to address council's comments and submitted revised supporting information. The revised supporting information helped address council's comments related to the amount and management of parking provided on site and the availability of on-street parking on Trailside Drive. In order to address council's desire to augment the availability of on-site parking, the site plan had been revised to include 4 additional residential parking spaces, resulting in 1 parking space for each of the 305 units proposed. In addition, the applicant has proposed the option of stacked parking in the underground parking garage, and staff are supportive of the concept of stacked parking, especially in the context of North Oakville, given that stacked parking provides the opportunity to maximize the number of parking spaces by stacking vehicles vertically while minimizing the amount of land used for parking. With respect to on-street parking, as a result of council's questions related to the amount of on-street parking that will be available on Trailside Drive, the applicant submitted a revised design for Trailside Drive. The width of the proposed right-of-way has been widened from 19 meters to 20.5 meters to provide on-street parking on both sides of Trailside Drive, resulting in 29 on-street parking spaces. Additional information is contained in the staff report, providing additional information requested by council, such as potential for shared parking, unbundled parking, availability of on-street parking in North Oakville, availability of transit, status of bonusing, and additional points for clarification. Staff were comfortable with the revised submission by the applicant that it addressed council's comments and could be reflected in an implementing zoning bylaw. A subsequent staff report was presented to council at the April 15th meeting, which addressed these matters. However, on March 14th, the town received a submission on behalf of White Oaks Communication in response to the subject application. The concerns raised by the White Oak submission identified potential issues related to impacts between the radio station and proposed development, including potential for nuisance, impact on the development, pre- and post-construction, and interference with the transmission of radio signals. As a result of the information, Council adopted this resolution before you, which deferred the application pending resolution of the White Oaks submission. Your Worship, this is the identical issue that we just heard on the previous proposal. And similarly, with respect to this application and these lands, which are approximately 1.6 kilometers separated from the radio towers, similarly, we found that the D6 guidelines are adhered to. There will be no issues with respect to health and safety emanating from this proposal, and that likewise through the site plan process, the similar warning clauses could be imposed through that process. So just as with Oakville Green, this application will also be subject to the same conditions through the site plan process. So I don't think it might be necessary to repeat the details with respect to that. So in conclusion, Your Worship, the recommendation and conclusion is found on the first page of the staff report, is being put forward to you for consideration.
Thank you. Are there questions, Council? Councillor Palmer?
Thank you for that presentation. I just wanted to thank staff for working with the applicant and really taking into consideration the concerns that we brought up regarding parking. I know there's still a lot of work to do with the parking strategies that we're hoping to implement, but I am satisfied with the solutions that that staff and the applicant came up with. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Councillor Palmer. Councillor Elgar, did you have something?
Yeah, well, you're right, I guess. It is the same issue as we've dealt with in item number 5, and you still feel that you don't agree with the statement that we should do the detailed modeling and mitigation plan before approving the proposed development. This is staff are saying we don't need to, correct?
Through you, Your Worship, yes, that's correct.
Okay, that's good. Now I know how I'm going to vote. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Elgar. Are there members of the public with information for Council on this matter? All right, thank you. Council, it's time to make a decision. Who has one to offer? Councillor Palmer, moving the recommendation. Thank you. Councillor Elgar, would you like another?
Recorded vote,
we'll have another recorded vote. All right. To be recorded in favor, please rise to be named. Councillor O'Meara, Councillor Robertson, Councillor Chisholm, Councillor Giddings, Councillor Hazathiel, Councillor Longo, Councillor Knoll, Councillor Grant, Councillor Adams, Councillor Lischina, Councillor Palmer, and Councillor Sanju. To be recorded in opposition, please rise to be named. Councillor Dudek and Councillor Elgar. Thank you. That also is close, but it does carry. Thank you, everybody. We have no advisory committee minutes listed for this agenda, and it is time for a motion to rise and report. Councillor Knoll, thank you. All those in favor? Opposed, if any? I rise and report the Committee of the Whole has met and made recommendations on public hearing item 1 and discussion items 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, as noted by the clerk. May I have a mover and seconder for the report? Councillor Grant and Councillor Robertson, thank you. All in favor? And the report is adopted. Council, is there any matter of emergency, congratulations, or condolence? Perhaps someone would like to wish good luck to the Raptors in a minute and a half. Councillor Sanju.
I would be happy to with my Go Raptors shirt on today, as well as my council colleagues. Go Raps.
Thank you very much. I see no other sign. I will ask then for a mover and seconder for consideration and reading of the bylaws. Councillor Longo, Councillor Lischina. May I put the vote? All in favor? And the bylaws are adopted. That completes our agenda. It's been great working with you. Thank you very much for your time and attention, your detailed questions. It's been great working with you, and we are adjourned.